US-Japan alliance has always been the core axis for securing the stability of Northeast Asia for the US. The US-ROK alliance, albeit its increased importance along with the economic rise of South Korea, not as much. The discrepancy in the weight of each alliance had also been displayed historically when the US drew the Atchison Line to ostracize the Korean peninsula out of its line of defense against communism before the break of the Korean War. Now, with potential talks of a peace treaty going on among the United States, South Korea, North Korea and China, the future of the US-Japan, US-ROK alliance seems to be at stake, with the latter being at higher risk. During the Korean War, Japan was under the occupation of Allied forces, functioning as a logistical base for the American troops fighting in the Korean peninsula. The war continuing against North Korean and later Chinese forces, withdrawing military bases from Japan was never in U.S. interests. Hence, the first U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was signed in 1951 to ensure the continued presence of American troops in Japan even after Japan's restoration of sovereignty. Since Japan was banned from having regular forces due to its pacifist constitution, the Japanese government accepted this treaty to counter the external threats from communist countries and to suppress the internal danger brought by domestic communists attempting to overthrow the government. The treaty was updated in 1960 to perpetuate the American military status in Japan. However, the purpose of this alliance, namely, to deter the communist menace, had to be redefined after the end of the Cold War. In 1997, the new guidelines for U.S.-Japan defense cooperation reframed the alliance as a regional public good contributing to the peace and stability of Northeast Asia. With problems remaining in Korea and Taiwan, complete withdrawal of American troops was too much of a risk both for the U.S. and Japan. Therefore, while a potential peace treaty between North Korea and South Korea may raise questions about the legitimacy of U.S. troops in South Korea, the legitimacy of U.S. forces in Japan is not likely to be harmed as much. Japan is not a logistical base for the troops only in the Korean peninsula, but also played the same role in the Vietnam War as well as in the recent Iraq War. Yokosuka has the headquarters of the U.S. 7th Fleet, which covers from the east of Indian Ocean to the western Pacific Ocean as its operational area, nearly half of the Earth. It is the key strategic force that keeps the U.S. dominance in the West Pacific against China. Such scale of force is not likely to be transferred to the Philippines, which is one of the U.S. allies near Japan, since the current defense cooperation agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines states that the permanent presence of American forces in the Philippines is not intended. In fact, the U.S. once completely shut down its bases in the Philippines in the early 90s. Another U.S. ally near Japan, Taiwan, cannot host any American base out of fear of provoking China. Some bases in Okinawa, Japan, where anti-American base movements are active, may be removed if the danger in Korea is reduced by the peace treaty, but the U.S. is likely to maintain most of its forces in Japan to keep its superior military status in East Asia. As the first and the only alliance treaty South Korea signed with any country, the US-ROK alliance has been perceived by the South Koreans as more than a simple alliance. The participation of the U.S. forces to fend off communist aggression and the humanitarian aids that followed embedded an extremely positive image of the U.S.'s presence in the peninsula. The initial purpose of the alliance was defending South Korea from any future North Korean aggression. However, as the South Korean economy, along with its military spending, completely eclipsed that of North Korea, the purpose of U.S. presence according to the alliance's precepts became questionable. Now the alliance remains as a deterrence for war or aggression with overwhelming strength of the US-ROK alliance against North Korea. If a peace treaty is to be signed, as she allegedly proposed, the role of U.S.'s presence as a deterrent may lose its legitimacy. North Korea would not pose threat to its neighbors anymore, as the treaty, if it were to be signed, would involve North Korea's nuclear renunciation. In fact, Trump had repeatedly accused South Korea to be free-riding on security, although it is completely capable of tending to its own needs considering its affluence. Therefore, without the will and legitimacy of U.S. presence, the U.S. military may indeed retreat in such a scenario. Whether the South Koreans want the U.S. to withdraw its forces, however, is another question. As previously mentioned, many South Koreans, especially the elderly who have lived through the ramifications of war, still see U.S. presence as the last threshold against communism in the peninsula. The South Korean president would have to make serious considerations on such domestic sentiments before agreeing to withdraw U.S. forces. The U.S., on the other hand, according to Trump, seems to be lacking willingness to continue to station its forces in the peninsula. he may lose further willingness in case of a peace treaty. Then ultimately, it will be the South Koreans who may be more desperate for U.S. presence than U.S. itself on the premise of U.S. reluctance if a peace treaty were to be signed. Whether the peace treaty will be signed remains ambiguous, but considering Trump's rhetoric since his tenure, some change in the U.S. forces stationing in South Korea is expected regardless. On the other hand, Japan will likely to play its role as a logistic base not only for the peninsula, but for the rest of the world as a core axis of U.S. military interests. In fact, no president of the U.S. has ever mentioned of considering a complete withdrawal from Japan during their presidencies. The U.S. may be confident to maintain the balance of power in East Asia without having its forces in the peninsula, but this cannot be said for the forces in Japan.